All right, good to be here with you all. For those of you that I have not met, my name's Trevor. I serve as the campus pastor actually at our Lehigh campus, so kind of the one campus we have down in Utah County. That is where I spend my days, but good to be with you all today. I just want to say, if you're brand new with us or whether you've been here for years, we're glad that you're here as well. Thanks for joining us for a conversation today that is on a word, centers really around one word that is a word that means a lot to many of us. It's a word that I think a lot of us approach with a certain degree of passion, even with a certain degree of intensity. And yet one of the things that I think really makes for an interesting conversation today is that while it's a word we care a lot about, it's not exactly a word that we all approach from the same perspective. And the word is justice. And so just kind of opening up, I think, with a quick definition, one clear way to understand justice is that it's that which is right, good, or true. And the contrast to that is also the case. So that which is unjust is that which is bad or evil and wrong and false. On an abstract level, I think at the very least, we do have the ability to agree over what justice is. But the second you begin to move from sort of an abstraction into a much more concrete conversation, all of a sudden we find ourselves in a place where we disagree. And I just want to share one example of that from about a week ago. So real quick, anybody from Colorado here? Anybody from any? Okay, we got a couple. Basically what I'm looking for are Broncos fans. We got any Broncos fans in the room? Okay, all right. Okay, so here's an example. This is something that took place about a week ago. Now what this is it's not, I know it probably looks like a catch, and the receiver is down by contact. I want you to know that's not what this is. That's not what's happening here. This is an interception that is still underway. The play is still continuing at this point. And so the Broncos fans in the room can probably understand that, to render this an interception is just. That is right, good, and true. If you're from Buffalo, you're probably ready to walk out. And if that's the case, if I have offended you, just know I'm not from here. And so I'm down in Lehigh. I'm not your regular guy. So, okay, so that's a silly example of injustice. But truth be told, we would not have to work that hard to find an example that is anything but silly. I think that's one of the reasons why this conversation can be challenging, because it pushes us pretty quickly into a lot of different topics that in today's world can be pretty polarizing. And yet I think for that very reason, it's worth exploring the question, what is justice and what does it mean to be just? In particular, from the perspective of the life that Jesus invites you and I into. What does it mean to be just? And that's really what I want to explore together over the course of the next 25 or so minutes that we have for this conversation. As we continue and even bring to a close our series, what it means to be, with this fourth and final installment. And so through that, just kind of setting the table for our conversation, the idea I want to explore together is just this idea that a good and beautiful life pursues justice. That a life that is good and beautiful, a good and beautiful life pursues justice, that is a piece of it. And if I could give kind of a trail marker or trail map for our conversation, these would be the two markers on it, the two sections that we're going to work through together. The first is identifying justice, and the second is pursuing justice. Identifying justice and pursuing justice. And so that being the case, let's get underway with that first section, identifying justice. I think an initial question is just like, okay, what is it and where does it come from? Who gets the ability to actually say what is good and what is not good, what is right and what is wrong? And from our perspective, the clear and easy answer to that is God. Genesis 1:31 tells us this, and this is the opening book of the Bible, opening chapter of the Bible. It says this, real quick. It says God saw all that he had made and it was very good. In other words, God is the one who brought all things into being. He's the creator of all things. And for that reason, if anyone has the ability to define what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong, it is God. And so God has the ability to define what is just. One of the encouraging things is that we see that this theme is not just something present within the first chapter of the Bible, but continues throughout the entirety of it. But real quick, I missed something. If we go back to that QR code, one of the things that is, that accompanies this series is the idea, as a church, we believe questions deserve answers. And so one of the ways we're doing that is just by opening up an opportunity for people to submit questions. If there's something from this talk that you're curious about, something that you've been wondering about that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, you can have the chance to basically scan that QR code, send the question on in, and then later this week, actually, there's going to be a few of us who are going to sit down and work through those questions in a kind of a long-form podcast and have the ability to discuss them. So if you've got questions, send them on in. Okay, jumping back in, identifying justice. God created all things. He's the one who defines what is good, what is not good. As this theme continues, you see that continue to develop. Psalm 89:14 tells us that righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. So God is the one who is sovereign over all, right? Who is the highest authority in all of reality. And this is telling us that justice and righteousness are core to the way that God approaches reality, to the way that he actually navigates sovereignty, to the way that God reigns, that justice and righteousness are core to who God is. As we continue in our survey of this theme, what we find though is that this doesn't just stick with God, it also becomes part of the life that Jesus invites you and I into. One of the core passages, key passages within this conversation is Micah chapter 6, verse 8, coming from the Old Testament. It says, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God, to pursue justice, but not in a way that is void of mercy, in a way that is accompanied by mercy and is marked by humility." That's one of the things that we see that Jesus invites us into. Proverbs 31:8-9 says this, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of those who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." And here we start to get a bit of an extension around the conversation, right? Micah 6:8 tells us to do justice. Well, what does that mean? This passage begins to draw attention in particular to those who are, you could say, vulnerable within society. The idea is that everyone, Genesis 1 tells us that everyone who has ever lived as a human is someone who's been created in the image of God. Therefore, they carry inherent worth and dignity. And yet, because we live in the midst of a world that is broken and flawed, there would be times where essentially attempts are made to treat certain individuals as if they are less than that, as if they are less than human. And so, as the theme of justice develops, it seems like one piece of the conversation is God's concern for those who are in a position that makes them vulnerable to be treated as if they're less than human. Let's continue the survey. Jeremiah 22:3. These words were specifically directed to the king of Judah, one of the kings of ancient Israel. And it says this is what the Lord says. "Do what is just and right. Rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. And do not shed innocent blood in this place." And so again, what we see, you can almost pair this passage alongside Romans chapter 13, which really gives us a clear understanding of the role of government. The government is intended to essentially restrain violence, to bring about the possibility of peace and flourishing for all who live within the scope of that government's authority. You see the very same instructions offered here to the king of Judah in Old Testament history. And so again, you see the same concern developing. Well, again, let's continue the survey and see how much further does this go? If we jump into the New Testament, does it show up there also? James 1:27 tells us this. This is the brother of Jesus himself, actually, one of the most significant leaders in the first century church, writing to fellow Christians. And he says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." In other words, when we survey this theme, this idea of justice, one of the things we find is that God is the author of justice, that justice finds its origins within the character of God, that God has concern in particular around this subject for those who find themselves in the most vulnerable positions within society. That was widows and orphans within the first century. And God invites us to share that concern. You actually even see this even within the ministry of Jesus, right? Throughout the 3 years when he was teaching and engaging with people all throughout Israel, he specifically sought out the outcasts and the ostracized, right? The sinners, the prostitutes, tax collectors, people that no one else wanted anything to do with were the people that Jesus specifically sought relationship out with himself, because this concern is core to who he is. And he invites us to share that concern as well. And I think one of the interesting things is that throughout the past 2,000 years of church history, you can see how followers of Jesus have taken this concern to heart. They've received that invitation, and it's led them to engage with the world in remarkable ways. For example, just a couple of those things would include the invention of the very first hospitals, places to care for the sick and the wounded, came about because of followers of Jesus. The very first orphanages, places to care for children without parent, without family, those were actually started and run by followers of Jesus. Even within the Roman Empire, the first several centuries, there was this practice called exposure, where it was legally acceptable to actually take a child that you did not want, a baby, and leave it outside the walls of the city. It was called exposure. And yet followers of Jesus, they began to take these kids as their own, essentially adopting them, raising them as their own, leaning into this particular practice, advocating for the worth and the dignity of every single person, including these particular children. And over the course of centuries, as they leaned against this, eventually brought an end to the practice of exposure entirely. And those are just a handful of examples. I could go on, right? If you look at when Christian missionaries arrived in India, one of the things that they encountered was the practice of sati, the burning of widows upon the other side of the husband dying. And it was actually the work of Christian missionaries leaning into this particular practice that brought it to an end. If you look at William Wilberforce, the 19th century member of British Parliament, spent over 20 years of his life, along with several of his friends, essentially leaning into bringing an end and finally securing an actual legal end and abolishment to slavery throughout the entirety of the British Empire. And that's not even to mention literacy itself, right? Like, one of the things that changes a person's life more than anything else is actually the ability to read. And the only reason that actually spread to every single person was so that every single person would have the ability to read and understand the Bible, to know who Jesus is, and to understand the life he invites us into themselves. And so over the course of the past 2,000 years, followers of Jesus have accepted the invitation to join God in this concern and have engaged this world in remarkable ways. Now, that's not to say there haven't been missteps, because there have been, and it doesn't do any help to anyone to just ignore that or to sidestep those realities. And yet at the same time, what I would rather spend our time doing together today is not so much casting blame on the mistakes of other people whose shoes you and I are not in. What I would rather do is spend our time considering, what does it look like for us to engage our world in our present moment? And I think if you take all these things into consideration, one of the clearest things that rises to the surface is that it's worth considering the question, who are the most vulnerable people around you? Who are the most vulnerable people within your community? The people who essentially are at the greatest risk of being treated as if they are less than human. And what does it look like to step into that situation and to engage? So that takes us to our second trail marker, pursuing justice. Pursuing justice. And here, I just want to share three very simple ideas for what it might look like for you and I to orient our lives around justice. And again, you could ask the question, well, why should I even do that? Well, a life that is good and beautiful pursues justice. And I think most of us want to get to the end of our days and look back with a sense of satisfaction over the way that we lived our lives. And so with that, first idea, pursue redemption rather than condemnation. Pursue redemption rather than condemnation. Here's what I mean. When I have the sense that someone has caused harm to me, when I have the sense that somebody has caused harm to someone that I love and care about, or even if I have the sense that someone has caused harm to just another person, typically what rises up within me, what wells up inside, is a desire for justice, but it's not a desire that is accompanied by grace or mercy or compassion or love or any of those things. It is accompanied by a desire for condemnation. Typically what I want is for that person to understand that they are wrong, to recognize that they are wrong, and to suffer the consequences of that. That is a desire for justice, but not necessarily one that is honoring to Jesus. Because instead, what he invites us into is actually to love our enemies, to love the people who are the so-called villains within our stories. 2 Corinthians 5:18 even tells us that we've been given the ministry not of condemnation, but the ministry of reconciliation. And so the question I would pose to you is, the people who perhaps are the so-called villains within your story, what would it look like to pursue justice in a way where the ultimate end was not condemnation, but the ultimate end was redemption? And I get that sometimes we're like, man, I'm not interested in that. That's not what I want for that person. That's not what I want in this situation. But if that's where you're coming from, let me just share a story about a man named Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway is probably more well known as the Green Ridge or the Green River Killer, one of the most prolific serial killers in all of American history. It's estimated that he actually killed over 70 women throughout his lifetime. And at the tail end of kind of the early 2000s, eventually the moment arrived where he was arrested, he was put on trial, he was convicted, and he was sentenced. But there was this scene in the midst of the courtroom on the other side of him being sentenced where so many of the family members of his victims, they had the ability to actually speak their piece to him, to say whatever they wanted to him in that moment. And they took full opportunity to do that. And some of the things they said to him, it was just giving full vent essentially to all of the pain that he had caused them, right? One of them said, he's an animal. I wish for him to have a long, suffering, cruel death. Another one said, he's going to hell, and that's where he belongs. And truth be told, I understand that. That makes sense to me. But through all of that, Gary Ridgway just sat there essentially stone-faced, completely emotionless, void of any feeling whatsoever. These words of poison, of venom, of condemnation, they did nothing to him. But at one point, one of the family members of one of the victims stood up. It was the father of a daughter whose life had been taken by this individual, a man by the name of Robert Rule. And he went on to address Gary Ridgway, and he said these words. He said, Mr. Ridgway, there are people here who hate you. I am not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe and what God says to do, and that is to forgive. And then he said these three simple words to him. He said, you are forgiven. And it was in that moment that the killer, Gary Ridgway, just broke down and began to sob. Just broke down crying. And I think if there's anything to glean from that example, it's that the thing that finally brought about change within him, the thing that finally brought about conviction, the thing that finally even brought about a sense of recognition and remorse for the things that he had done was not words of venom or poison or condemnation. It wasn't any of that. It was words of grace and forgiveness that finally brought this about within his life. And maybe you're still sitting here saying, yeah, but that's not what I want. I want justice. And I think the thing I would caution you to consider is don't let your pursuit of justice allow you to become the thing which you hate. Don't let your pursuit of justice allow you to become a person who is more marked by hate than by the love that Jesus invites us into. Now, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, and that is good, right, and just. I'm not saying this removes the consequences, but I am saying it is possible to pursue justice in a way that is aimed at redemption rather than condemnation. And that's what Jesus invites us into. All right, so that's the first idea. Beyond that, second idea, let relationships expand your circle of concern. Let relationships expand your circle of concern, expand the things which you care about. One of the things that I've noticed about myself across my 30-some years of life is that my tendency is that if something does not affect me directly, it does not affect me at all. If something doesn't affect me directly, like if there's some decision made or something said or something that happens that impacts the lives of those around me, oftentimes the tendency is that it impacts them, but because it doesn't impact me directly, it doesn't impact me at all. And I think that's a trait that a lot of people share, and it's a trait that you actually see Jesus engaging with pretty directly throughout his ministry. For example, one of the ways in which he does that is as he is forming his group, essentially his community group, the disciples, one of the things he does is he approaches that with a high degree of intentionality. He invites the same people into his group, right, who on the one hand are as far left as you could possibly imagine, and on the other hand are as far right as you could possibly imagine. In the ancient world, he invites them into the same group so that they can be changed, not just by their relationship with him, but also by their relationships with each other. So that on the other side of getting to know one another, on the other side of laughing together and going through hardship together, through the highs and lows and just the mundane moments of being in community with people over the course of a lifetime, over the span of time, all of a sudden you find yourself in a place where instead of approaching life from the standpoint, if something doesn't affect me directly, it doesn't affect me at all. Instead of that, all of a sudden you find yourself in a place where it's if something affects one of us, it affects all of us. And that actually continues beyond the disciples, even into the church itself. The book of Acts gives us a history of how the church spread and grew throughout the Roman Empire in the first century. And one of the kind of fun themes of that book is the way in which everyone is shocked and surprised over who ends up being a part of the church as it spreads throughout the Roman Empire. People had no idea what was coming. And you can see that this causes so much of the mess within the New Testament because people who are different oftentimes have trouble getting along. And yet the thing that brings us together is Jesus. And you can see this worked out in so many of the New Testament letters. For example, the church in Rome was marked by people from all different pockets of society, and yet they're brought into community together. One of the things that's written to them to help them as they navigate the struggles of being in community with people who are different from them is this idea. Romans 12:15 says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn." In other words, if something affects one of us, it affects all of us. That includes the good and the bad, the celebrations and the hardships. And I think one of the interesting things about this conversation, you can almost look at it like this, like coming in to have a conversation, to do a sermon on justice, especially in light of so many of the things that have happened in our country. It's almost like, how can you have this conversation without in some way referencing the things that have taken place, even just over the past couple of days? And I'm sure that there are some of you here who, in reference to the events that have unfolded within Minnesota, and in some ways are still unfolding, there's some of you who want me to say one thing in particular, and there's probably others of you who want me to say the exact opposite thing. And I think what actually is worth saying, what I want to lean into in this particular conversation is just the idea that to treat anyone as if they are less than human because they are different than you or because you disagree with them is something that is fundamentally wrong. And hear me, I'm not saying like it's wrong in the sense of like, shame on you, how could you be such a terrible person? That's not the conversation that I'm trying to have. It's wrong in the sense that it's fundamentally disagreeing with God. Because one of the things that God clearly states is that in the Bible is that every person is created in his image, and so is a person who carries inherent worth and dignity. And so to treat anyone as if they are less than that is to disagree with God himself and is to succumb to becoming something that is less than human. And so again, I'm not saying shame on you, how could you be so terrible? What I'm saying is Jesus invites us into something better, into something more whole. And I think one of the ways that happens is as we're brought into relationship with other people, all of a sudden it's not if it doesn't affect me directly, it doesn't affect me at all. It's if it affects one of us, it affects all of us. And one example of that hits a little bit closer to home is, Pastor Alberto is one of the pastors here at SMCC who actually started and has led our international campus for over a decade. And one of the challenges that he's run into lately is that over the course of the past several months, he's actually been orchestrating the care of over 40 kids whose parents have been detained or deported, many of whom actually had papers, and yet in their situations, it did not matter. Now, you could ask the question, does that impact me directly? And if I'm speaking for myself, the answer is no. Right? This doesn't impact my kids. This doesn't impact my family. This does not impact me directly. But again, what Jesus invites us into is something more than that. What he invites us into is if something impacts one of us, it impacts all of us. And so, what does it look like to allow your relationships to expand your circle of concern, to expand the things that you care about? That's the second one. And the third idea, third and final one is this: to make one problem your problem. One of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. said, who actually was a preacher and a pastor before he was ever a civil rights activist, is that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, which is true. And yet so often what's baked into our interpretation of these particular words is that you have to pursue justice everywhere. And it's like, that is impossible, right? Never before in the history of the world have we ever been so aware of how broken and flawed this world is in each and every part and portion of it. And if you try to pursue all of that, if you try to fix all of that, you'll end up fixing nothing. And essentially just, you'll end up signing up for a life that is incredibly miserable and angry. And much of that anger will end up becoming voiced through your social media channels, right? That's what it will be. And so the alternative is not just to throw in the towel and say, man, there's nothing to be done about it. It's to say, what does it look like to opt for not fixing every problem, but to make one problem yours? To make one problem your problem. And I think so many of our ministry partners are incredible examples of this. For example, Conversa Language School. They've chosen specifically to make one problem their problem, of helping people within this area essentially to learn English as a second language, because once that occurs, that is life-changing in a dramatic sense, not just for the individual, but even for the family as a whole. And because they focused on one particular problem, they've been able to have an incredible impact. Another example of that is Holding Out Help, a ministry that has chosen to make one problem its problem, of helping people who are coming out of polygamous situations to find the resources and the care and the support and the education that they need to get on their feet and go on to live incredibly meaningful and significant lives. They've been able to have an impact because they've made one problem their problem. And so what does it look like for us, essentially, to do the same? If a life that is good and beautiful pursues justice, then the question is, how do we meaningfully pursue justice? And the best answer that I have to offer to that question is just this: pursue redemption over condemnation. Allow your relationships to expand your circle of concern and make one problem your problem. But let's go home on this. In 1929, the novelist Ernest Hemingway released his second major novel, A Farewell to Arms, which is a novel that tells the story of a young American serving as an ambulance driver in the Italian army in World War I, his name being Frederick Henry. And over the course of the story, he ends up getting injured, essentially, almost blown up by a mortar shell. And while he's healing, in the midst of his convalescence, he is cared for by a nurse by the name of Catherine Barclay. And the two of them go on to develop a romantic relationship. Things turn south as he re-enters the war, and basically they make the decision at a certain point to just flee from the battle altogether, to flee from the war altogether. And so at the tail end of the book, it actually looks like they have succeeded in their escape. They're expecting a child. They're beginning to build a family. It seems like they have found peace and a future and freedom that they are excited to share together. And then, in the midst of her labor and delivery, complications arise. And what ends up happening is both the mother and the child, they die. And famously, the closing scene of the book is the main character leaving the hospital and walking back to his hotel room alone and in the rain. One of the really curious motifs that is present, it's littered on the pages of this book, is the presence of rain. right? Through all of the violence, through all of the chaos, through all of the suffering, it seems like through the whole thing, it's just constantly raining. And it's like, is this because the guy didn't have like Google Docs and didn't realize like he needed to go back and edit this out? Why is it constantly raining? Until you get to the end of the book, and then there's a clue offered that essentially gives us an understanding of why it's always raining. It's because the rain means something. When the complications arise with the labor and the delivery, the main character, he is removed from the room so as to not be a distraction to the medical team. And while he's off on his own in the midst of an incredibly stressful situation, for the first time in the book, he actually turns his attention to God and he begins to pray. He asks God, he begs God to spare the lives of these people that he loves. And then on the other side of his prayer, he recalls a memory from earlier in the war, when he was standing around a fire and he took a log and placed it on the fire to continue to feed it. And on the other side of this, he recognized that the log was filled with ants. And the ants, all of a sudden finding themselves in a difficult situation, are doing whatever they can. They're scrambling to escape the heat and the flames that are bringing about their death. And the thought occurs to him, I could be their savior. I could be their Messiah if I cared enough to just simply reach down and remove this log for the fire. But he doesn't. Instead, he simply chooses to kind of flick out the last few drops of water that are in his can on the fire, not in an attempt to actually help the ants, but simply because he wanted to empty his cup so he could refill it with whiskey and enjoy a drink. In other words, the water that he flicks onto the fire is a symbol of his indifference to the ants and their suffering. And in the same way, the rain is a symbol of God's indifference to us in our suffering. I think sometimes you can look around this world and see so many things that are broken, so many things that are flawed. You can see so much injustice, so many things that are just flat out wrong. And you ask the question, how can this be? If God is actually good, if God is actually just, if God is actually righteous, if God is actually loving, if God is even actually real, then how can this actually be the case? How can the world even be the way that it is? It just seems like God does not care. Like he is indifferent to us in our suffering and in the injustice of this world. And yet one of the things that is more clear than anything in this book is that Jesus is anything but indifferent to you in your suffering. That he is anything but indifferent to the injustice of this world, because what he specifically did was he chose to pursue redemption over condemnation. He chose to allow relationships expand the circle of his concern. He allowed himself to be impacted by that which did not impact him directly. And he chose to make one problem his problem, which was the problem of our brokenness and our sin. He made it his problem, even to the extent of offering his life on the cross for our forgiveness and for our redemption. Which is why it's true to say that a life that is beautiful and good pursues justice, and there is no clearer example of that than Jesus himself. And so as we bring our service to a close, the band is going to lead us in a song that is designed to turn our attention and allow us to even reflect upon and even celebrate these very things. And on the way to that, what I want to invite you to do is, I just want to invite you to stand as we pray together on the way to this song. So would you stand and pray with me? Jesus, we give you praise as the one who is just, who is good, who is righteous. And rather than pursuing justice on our behalf, what you were willing to do was pursue our redemption, to meet us with mercy, to meet us with compassion, to meet us with love. And yet even now, in the midst of a world that is broken and flawed, you invite us to join in your concern and to seek to, in some small way, fix the brokenness that marks the world around us in a way that reflects your glory and brings peace and healing and flourishing, not just for ourselves, but for those who are around us. We thank you for the examples of so many people who have pursued this in ways that are admirable. And we thank you that despite our flaws and our brokenness, you continue to invite us to join you in this and to know the joy that comes with seeing you at work in incredible ways in this world. And so for all this, we thank you and we praise you, trusting that one day you will set all things right and make all things new. Amen.